Hi. My name is Sarah Abrevaya-Stein. I'm a professor of modern Jewish history and the newest faculty member at the University of Washington's Jewish Studies program. It is my great pleasure tonight to welcome you to the Samuel and Althea Stroum Lecture Series. Before introducing Dr. Calvin Goldscheider, I would like to take this opportunity to describe some of the exciting initiatives currently sponsored by the Jewish Studies program. As many of you know, this year the program celebrates its 25th year of excellence in teaching, scholarship, and public service, and what growth we are still experiencing. In conjunction with the Department of Germanics, we have launched a Yiddish summer program, offering both a course in Yiddish language and culture and a series of public cultural events. We have also embarked on a Sephardic Studies initiative that brings together faculty from over 6 departments in the university, that offers new curriculum in the field of Sephardic Studies, that has helped to build the University of Washington Library's holdings in Ladino, and which sponsored a tremendously successful film series this winter. Many of you noticed that our efforts were recognized recently on the front page of the Seattle Times. In addition, this past year has seen dynamic, vital growth in our curriculum in Hebrew Bible, American Jewish life, and the contemporary Jewish experience. The creation of several student scholarships has heralded exciting new opportunities for the program and our students. This year, we have also been fortunate enough to have Dr. Aviva Ben-Ur as the Hazel D. Cole Fellow for 1999-2000. Aviva has contributed greatly to our program, to the shaping of Sephardic studies, and to the intellectual dynamism of Jewish studies. Next year, we will welcome Jonathan Dechter as the Hazel D. Cole Fellow for 2000-2001. He will be teaching the first in a 2-part series on the history of Sephardic Jewry, and he will be teaching a course on the history of the Jews in Spain. Many of these developments would not have been possible without the generosity of the Stroum family, whose commitment over the years to the University of Washington and the Jewish Studies program we are all greatly indebted to. I am pleased to be able to introduce you to Dr. Calvin Goldscheider, Professor of Sociology and DeRote Professor of Judaic Studies at Brown University. I first met Drs. Calvin and Fran Goldscheider when I was an undergraduate at Brown University, and it is a great pleasure to welcome them both to the University of Washington as colleagues and as friends. In his first lecture delivered this Monday, Professor Goldscheider argued that Jewish culture in America and in Europe is, in his words, surviving and thriving, despite gloomy claims to the contrary that circulate in the popular imagination and in much scholarship about the contemporary Jewish experience. At the close of his first lecture, Professor Goldscheider encouraged us to direct our attention away from fears of dissolution and towards a consideration of what defines a Jewish quality of life. He left us on Monday with the provocative and complex question, survival for what? I am confident that he will continue to challenge us with answers tonight. Professor Goldscheider will address the theme, the centrality of Jewish values in the shaping of the Jewish future.
Thank you very much, Sarah. He was a typical extraordinary Jew. His name was Shmuel Braff. He regularly sat next to me in my shul in Talpiot, Jerusalem, and from time to time during the various learned talks and at other intervals during the prayers, and on the walk home on Friday evenings, he told me tantalizing stories about his life, half in Yiddish, half in Australian accented English, with a strong Polish twist. He goes to bed quite late, he says, so that he'll be certain of sleeping till the next morning. Sometimes the nightmares wake him, and then he knows he won't go to sleep again. He did not describe his nightmares, but knowing that he lost his wife, their only daughter, his mother, 2 sisters, their husbands and children, and countless other relatives and friends during the Second World War, and learning that he himself was a survivor of a Siberian labor camp, it's not hard to imagine what he dreams about. I began to interview Shmuel to put a human face on the macro-European picture of Jewish transformation that I was studying. I wanted to know whether I could illustrate the themes of change among Jewish communities with several qualitative insights from diverse persons of European origins living in Jerusalem. I failed to carry out that part of the project, but I had another motive in this exploration, the exploration of how to learn about Jewish values. And I discovered several years ago that Shmuel had many things to teach us about Jewish values and about how we should think about Jewish futures. Shmuel was born around the turn of the 20th century in Tarnów, a middle-sized city about 45 miles east of Krakow in the Galicia sector of Poland. Initially, I was curious why he and millions of others like him chose to remain in Poland rather than follow the large stream of outmigration to America, the land of opportunity where the streets were paved with gold. Had they immigrated to America, they would have been spared the horrors of the Second World War. The answer that he gave was rather straightforward. He and his family remained in Tarnów in large part because they were doing well economically with good prospects for continuing to live in prosperity. His clients in the lumber and coal business were local, his family and economic networks were powerful, and his family was comfortable in Poland. His view of the future at that point in his life was rather positive. Indeed, his description of life in Poland in the 1920s and 1930s parallel in many ways the stories that one reads about life among American Jews of Polish origins living in New York and in other places where poor Jews from Eastern Europe settled and became American. For many, Tarnów was home. There was anti-Semitism and discrimination, and Tarnów Jews did not have all the rights and privileges that others had in Poland, but these were attitudes and limitations that were not new in the 1920s and 1930s. Indeed, social mobility and assimilation were the hallmarks of the day. Theater, good times, art, travel, attending lectures, going out to schmooze with the boys characterized middle-class Polish Jews, or at least Jewish men, as it did in America. Shmuel's future appeared to him to be rosy, full of excitement and possibility. He was an optimist. Life was improving for him and his family, even in retrospect. He spoke of the beautiful life in Tarnów before the Second World War. What did the future look like to him in the 1930s in Poland? He was married, a father, a prosperous businessman, self-confident, increasingly active in the Jewish community. He expected the Jewish community to continue for the rest of his life for him and his family. Certainly, he had no reason to expect the Holocaust coming from Germany would engulf Tarnów and destroy every vestige of Jewish life there, all the buildings and all the people who lived in them. He certainly expected that despite the challenges of survival due to poverty and discrimination, the Jews of Tarnów would continue to live there for centuries, as they had in the past, despite all adversity. Most of its members probably thought that the Jewish community of Tarnów had a future, and their own future was bound up with Tarnów. One lesson about the future: people stay where they are and expect to remain where they are when they have roots and connections. Even when the circumstances become very difficult, they have no Wanderlust. They don't wander. Tarnów was a heterogeneous community where religious and secular Jews lived, where Zionists and socialists argued, and where most of the community took care of its own. Shmuel was a capitalist businessman, but he supported socialist groups because the socialists, he said, were doing things for the community. Shmuel reported to me, "I gave money to the Zionists, but I wouldn't vote for them because the only party that was doing something for the Jews in Tarnów was the socialists. The Zionists were doing a good job, but they weren't interested in local life. They only cared about the future, 1,000 years from now, a dream. The real situation didn't interest them. Socialists were trying to help the people." Much of that recedes in the background as the war and the Holocaust of World War II emerged in the late 1930s and 1940s. He last saw his daughter on a transport with her schoolmates being led away to the outskirts of Tarnów by the Nazis. The Nazis never had a chance to shoot them, as their teachers gave them poisoned chocolates on the truck to avoid certain death awaiting them. Shmuel and other Jews buried their children on the outskirts of Tarnof. Shmuel survived the war, though barely, through his own ingenuity and through luck. Surviving the Holocaust appears to be random in those cities and towns where most were killed. After World War II, Shmuel returned to Tarnof, as he had with his family after World War I, in the hope that he would connect with his wife, who had been transported, so he thought, to the labor camp called Auschwitz, not known to him then as a synonym of genocide. He returned to Tarnof, but he was not prepared for what he found. He described his return as follows: nothing, a cemetery. Shmuel's voice sounds as if his mouth was still full of gall. The whole city, he said, was a cemetery. I mean the Jewish part. Nothing doesn't exist. Now he's angry. From the buildings is left only roofs, no windows, no doors, rubbish, rubble everywhere. The streets are full of that. Nothing. Nothing. When one thinks of the Holocaust, one thinks mainly of the murders, an inconceivable number of individual murders. One forgets the destruction of property, of monuments and community buildings, of houses and synagogues, schools, clubs, hospitals, shops, the material creation of tight-knit communities that had dwelled in one spot for centuries. Shmuel is a man with a highly developed sense of place, and his place was utterly destroyed. Even before reliable information about the extent of the tragedy was available, the physical annihilation of the Jewish half of the town meant that everything was gone. How did you feel? I ask. You're not lonely, he tells me. His voice is strangled, the words are almost swallowed. You're not lonely, but lost. People without life. You want nothing. You just want death. His voice strains without feeling to anything, and everyone felt the same. Then one feeling emerged, the overwhelming need to leave Poland as soon as possible. Were you shocked when you first got back to Tarnof, I asked. Shocked, he asked indulgently with a smile he reserves for a particularly silly question. What do you mean shocked? I couldn't sleep weeks at a time. I was wandering around, I couldn't go to bed. You know, I was in that street where I lived with my first wife and child about a dozen times. His voice lowers to almost a whisper. And up to the house where I was living, I couldn't go in. It had been a rented apartment in a neighborhood that was not walled in when the Nazis created the ghetto. Many of Shmuel's belongings were probably still there, but he couldn't force himself over the threshold. His mother's house stood nearby. He walked by it more than a dozen times, but again, he couldn't go in. He did enter his oldest sister's house. Her house was a new one, now occupied by a Polish family. Shmuel went in to talk to the new lady of the house, and he was appalled to see his sister's furniture unharmed and in the same place. He says that on the way out, back to his rented room, some 5 kilometers, excuse me, I was vomiting all the way back. I was meshuggah. I was sure I was finished. I was sick a week's time in bed. Shmuel has some pictures taken in Tarnof in 1946. One shows a broken column with Hebrew letters carved on it. The survivors erected a memorial in the Jewish cemetery where Shmuel said Jews are buried in 8 mass graves. He repeated that many times. The picture of the memorial doesn't affect me much. A broken pillar from the synagogue with a simple inscription. I've seen too many memorials. I'm more shaken when I hear that every Jewish survivor in Tarnof placed a stone in the commemorative wall visible behind the pillar. On my stone, there were 17 names, Shmuel tells me. That's a statistic one can grasp. An extended family was reduced to a handful of isolated survivors. What's left of Shmuel's Tarnof? The Jewish houses and institutions no longer stand. 9/10 of the Jews who lived there were murdered. Those who survive now live in dozens of foreign cities on every continent in the world. The close-knit society which shaped Shmuel's personality, fostered his development, had been ripped to shreds. Shmuel is one of the tattered remnants, and he still yearns for the whole cloth from which he was torn. He never lost his vitality, however. He showed me another photograph. It's of himself, neat, clean, well-dressed. Next to him, smiling shyly, is an attractive young woman, Esther, his second wife. Esther had appeared in Uzbekistan toward the end of the war with a small group of young Ukrainian Jews, following rumors of their relative survival. Her village had been completely destroyed. When the repatriations began, she and some other people with nowhere else to go joined Shmuel. Their only hope for living a normal life was to leave Tarnow. "I will do everything I can to get out," says Shmuel, remembering his thinking in 1946. "You can't live in a cemetery." He and other survivors in Tarnow saw that they had to come back to a normal life. You know what I mean. You fell in the mud, but you can't stay dirty all your life, true or not. And then he quotes from a popular Yiddish poem, "The Goldene Kite," the golden chain. "You have to keep adding links to the chain," he said. That was a theme of their discussions at night. They weren't prepared to give up. I asked, "What made you want to live after what you had seen?" He takes my provocatively blunt question seriously. It is legitimate to wonder about those things. He tells me, first thing, you got a feeling that they won't destroy the Jewish people. He wanted to build back a Jewish life to what it was in Poland. But that was not possible. He and Esther made their way with thousands of others across the Czech border, then to Austria, finally to Italy, where they awaited individual solutions to their problems. Esther and Shmuel made their way from Poland to Italy in trucks and by foot. Hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews walking to Italy on their way to Palestine from Poland. An amazing sight. But Shmuel never got to Palestine. There was too much conflict there. His brother, who had moved to Palestine in the 1930s, dissuaded him from coming. It was too difficult. So he was selected to go to a place the furthest from his Tarnow that he could find, and he ended up in Melbourne, Australia for 25 years. The Jewish community in Melbourne sponsored a number of refugees. Shmuel left Italy at the age of 43 with an infant daughter, his pregnant wife Esther, not knowing a word of English. I asked him if he was an optimist at that point. Would he be able to recapture the Jewish life he lived in Tarnow and the Jewish community of Melbourne? He evaded the question. He said, "In Melbourne, life was normal, but not in a Jewish way. As much as I pressed and probed, I could learn little about his life in Melbourne. It simply wasn't his community." He survived there and raised his two daughters and worked hard. And after moving to Jerusalem to retire and join one of his daughters who was there, he said he forgot about Melbourne. Even the names of the streets, he said, but never about Tarnow. He was now, he told me, a Jerusalemite with some pride and a little unease. When pressed, he wouldn't call himself a Zionist, although he did concede that in his view, the future of most Jewish communities in the world was bound up with the future of Israel. He remembered his feelings after World War II. We looked around, we could see Jews were very different, not in looks, not how they dressed, not in behavior, just going around like a stray dog, afraid of something, always afraid of something. You see two Italians, you know it's their land, we are the strangers. When Shmuel was first married, he was a vigorous man in his mid-20s, well known in his hometown and employed in a prospering family business. His future seemed to offer him steady progress towards wealth, comfort, and influence, an enviable prospect. 16 years later, as he entered into a second marriage, what could he reasonably expect? There was no way of knowing. He didn't know where he would settle, what new language he would have to learn, or how he would support himself. In Poland at this age, he would have had the prospect of easing off, passing some of the burden to a nephew or a son-in-law. After the war, it was clear that was not possible. Sometimes Shmuel felt depressed. He could see no future in Judaism. The war uprooted the plant and poisoned its native soil. I asked, so where am I supposed to get my Jewishness, my Yiddishkeit. If Tarnof and places like Tarnof contain the only authentic Judaism, and they are all destroyed, then what about the people born after the destruction? Where can they find real Jewishness? Shmuel was hard hit by the question. I don't have an answer, he said. From his point of view, Judaism today is without foundation. I asked the question in a different way. How can your daughter Rivka manage to live a full Jewish life? Where does she draw? She agrees with me, Shmuel answered. She got it from her parents. So won't her children get it from her, I asked? Shmuel wasn't sure. He saw Judaism getting weaker and weaker as time went on. But I refused to let up, as you all remember from Monday night. I remember Shmuel telling me that his 3-year-old grandson already knew the Modeh Ani, the first morning prayer. I thank you, O living and eternal King, for returning my soul to me in mercy. Great is your faithfulness. Don't you feel wonderful when you hear your grandson say that prayer? And he admitted that he did. Shmuel was buried in the kibbutz cemetery where his where his daughter and her family have made a home for themselves. He spent the last few years of his life there, lost and unconnected beyond his family. The last time I saw him, he had lost much of his energy and most of his memory, but his stories about the future live on in his children and grandchildren that he loved. Shmuel had several conceptions of the future throughout his life. In each case, his conception was based on the context of the present circumstances of his life. So when he returned to Tarnof after World War I, he had a conception that was positive of his future. When he returned after World War II, he had a negative view of his future in the context of Poland. Optimism and pessimism as contexts radically changed. When he was in Italy, his conception of his future included Palestine, but he rejected that option. When he was in Australia, he had a conception of his future and that of his children, first in Australia and then in Israel. When he was in his last days living in Jerusalem, he had a conception of his future as lived by the grandchildren that he had in Israel. Australia, a different place from Tarnof. Jerusalem, different from both, but some cultural continuity, the recitation of his prayer. We use oral histories to shed light on the past and for understanding the present. And what's the role of oral history in studying the Jewish future? At first glance, the answer is that oral history is the least likely methodological strategy for understanding how people use and study the future. But on closer inspection, the oral history may be an underutilized strategy for understanding how conceptions of the future shape actions in the present and help us understand the basis of decision-making. More importantly, it may be one of the strategies for understanding the role of values in shaping our lives. Values are always anchored in contexts. Structure provides possibilities. Values are how we take advantage of the possibilities and opportunities. Shmuel Braf's story is not simply a story of a survivor, but of all of us. Even within the lifetime of one person, we can reconstruct the various meanings of futures and learn important rules for disentangling processes of change. The transmission generationally of the Modeh Ani, something familiar culturally and Jewish, that Shmuel said to his grandfather and his grandson recited for him. Since conceptions of the future are conditioned by the context of the present, that suggests that the futures that we perceive always are best conceptualized, not as predictions, but as values. We transmit values in ways that may never have been done before, but it is still real as Jewishness is strengthened in new ways. The kibbutz was not Tarnoff, and the relationship to his grandchildren in Israel was something he never could have imagined. Conceptions of the future are variables, not constants. It suggests that taking the pulse of the future at any time reflects the moment rather than the future. Shmuel, in the end, saw his future as transmitting the core of Jewish values to his children and grandchildren, and that core to him was a familiar prayer that resonated his experiences in his grandchildren's recitation. That great golden chain of generational continuity in families of cultural items, whatever they may be, represents one Jewish value. Values transformed by context and new experiences. But what are the core Jewish values that are not family, idiosyncratic, and individual? How do we go beyond the individual to get a peek at some core Jewish values? In addition to learned experiences, values come from texts, from those documents that reinforce the cultural core and are reinterpreted regularly to speak to the next generation. In Jewish life, there are books that are defined as holy and are selectively taught to children and adults. From this, we also learn about values and conceptions of the future. And I want to briefly look with you at the source book of Jewish values, the Hebrew Bible. Who is the personification of the Jewish futurist in the Bible? It is, of course, the prophet, the Navi. The Navi is one of several administrative roles outlined in the Torah, and an understanding of these roles represent the values of how Jewish secular and religious leadership should be organized in Jewish communities and in the state of Israel at the beginning of the 21st century. The judge, the administrative official, the priests, the Levites, the king, all have specific roles. So does the prophet. We are told the following about the prophet. The Navi is to be selected among you, eliminating the non-Jew, the foreigner, but more importantly, the role of the prophet is in the community, not isolated from it, but a part of it. God informs the prophet what to report. There's no indication that the Navi takes any initiative. The prophet seems to be the conduit for God's words. He conveys these words in his own idiom and style, but the ideas are God's and not his or hers. The content of the prophet's message is God's. The form is the prophet's. How do we tell that the words of the prophet are the message of God? There are two tests according to the Bible. If the prophet conveys a content that suggests a false God, he's liable for punishment. Content is one of the elements of trueness among prophets. More directly, when you ask, how do I know that the words of the prophet have spoken, that the words that the prophet have spoken are true or not? That is, how do we differentiate between the true and false prophet? The answer that's given is when the prophet speaks in the name of God and his prophecy does not come about, then the prophet has spoken incorrectly or falsely. So the prophet really has two roles. One, to convey the words of God, and two, to predict the future. The decision whether the prophet has spoken God's words is left to whom? To the judgment of the people of the future. Not miracles, not some additional revelation, but people decide on the basis not of popularity, but on the basis of empirical evidence. The need for a prophet as the conveyor of God's words in no way absolves people of their responsibility to decide in retrospect that the predictions that the Navi makes of the future are true. This is, of course, a very rigid test. The wise prophet steers away from future predictions or makes them vague and well into the future. Problem, of course, is that we often need to make a judgment about the truthfulness or accuracy of a prediction and act accordingly, and we cannot wait for the future to inform us about the truths of the past. So in the two tests of the truthfulness of the prophet, content is always more powerful, more immediate than prediction. The Talmud, however, notes that the prophet neither took or added to the words of the Torah, of the Bible, and the prophets did not add or subtract from the words of God. While the Talmud, obviously, the rabbis of the Talmud were obviously committed to the study of the messages of God as conveyed by the prophets, and included the study of the prophets as part of the worship service, they had some ambivalence about prophets. In the Mishnah, for example, the prophet is defined as a conveyor of the Torah in a chain with no specialized or overriding role. Moses receives the Torah on Sinai, conveys it to Joshua, giving it to the elders. They gave it to the prophets who gave it to the rabbis of the Great Assembly. No special role, just the transmitter of the law and the values. More surprising, the Talmud teaches that since the death of the last of the prophets, the Holy Spirit of prophetic inspiration departed from Israel. Who gets prophecy in the post-prophetic period? Well, as you might imagine, there's a disagreement in the Talmud. One rabbi from Haifa said, since the days when the temple were destroyed, prophecy has been taken away from prophets and given to the wise. So God reveals himself to chachamim, to wise people, at least in the view of those wise men who wrote the Talmud. The other rabbi says, since the Talmud was destroyed, prophecy was taken from prophets and given to fools and children. Only false prophets remain. Why are the rabbis so concerned about the end of prophecy? Well, the answer about why the rabbis rejected the active role of contemporary prophets reflects a fear of the distortion of the role of the prophets, and because several of our more illustrious prophets preached futures that did not come about. A real problem if you're predicting a future and the evidence seems to suggest otherwise. How could he really be a good prophet anyway? But it's probable that the rejection of prophecy was in negative reaction to Christianity, which emerged with a prophet preaching additions and subtractions from the Torah as a basis for a New Testament. I think there's a more fundamental reason for the rejection of the role of the prophet as a futurist. This reason goes to the heart of Judaism as an emerging religious system, as a set of values. Rabbinical or normative Judaism of the Talmud and of our rabbis is a Judaism based on morals and ethics, and it is a Judaism based on law and its development. The promulgation of law is not the role of the prophet. It's not the expertise of the prophet. It would be a chaotic system, indeed, if people claimed to hear the word of God, promulgated new laws, eliminated old laws, and we had to wait for some sign in the future to determine whether these visions were correct. A religion based on law is unusual and demanding. It is not simply a religion of belief, not of being Jewish, but of doing Jewish, of action. If you had to wait until prophecy was deemed true in the future, you couldn't act at all. Judaisms are based on Torah and the development of rabbinic law and interpretation, not on prophecies of the future. The rabbis, of course, had to be supportive of the prophets and incorporate the words and ideas of the prophet who are the conduits of God's message. Each prophet speaks in his or her idiom of their world, even as all true prophets speak the word of God without innovation, without addition, without subtraction. Others have to develop the law. They are the innovators. Prophets are not seers, but messengers. It is Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses our teacher, not Moses the prophet, that we remember. It is our rabbis and teachers, our religious functionaries, who carry on the traditions of teaching Torah and interpreting in innovative ways that's changed the role of the prophet from passive to active, from conduit to initiator. The role of the prophet has become specialized and limited to interpreting the present, not predicting the future, that is, conveying values. And it is the role undertaken by the rabbis, our teachers, that transformed the futurism of the prophet to be the conduit of the religious, legitimate message. Indeed, not only religious functionaries, have inherited the transformed role of the prophet. It is our responsibility to make the future happen and see to it that the ideals are worked out as the Word of God and His prophets, our Judaism. Now, one of the central roles that I didn't talk about, and that the Bible deals with extensively in ancient Israel, was the role of the priests and the Levites. Not the prophet, but the priests and the Levites. And here, there's a lot more information. They're in charge of the entire sacrificial system and the temple. They have their own instructional manual. The third book of the Hebrew Bible, Leviticus, Vayikra, is called Torat Kohanim, the handbook for priests. It's a book focusing on animal and other sacrifices, their types, their regulations, procedures, details on what has to be burned and what's to be consumed, by whom and how, all in meticulous detail. On the surface, it appears for Jews living in the 21st century American society as a particularly uninteresting, irrelevant book, removed from our society and our modern lives. What kind of values could we draw from this system? Perhaps we think that the themes of Leviticus were an appropriate guide during the temple period. Maybe it was useful for the period after the destruction of the temple to retain the freshness of the sacrificial cult and keep it alive, to remember the immediate past, to reinforce hope for the restoration of the temple of animal sacrifices. But in American society, at the beginning of the 21st century, the book of Leviticus appears to be particularly uninspiring, detailed text, not accessible to our community and not meaningful to our lives. Here in the United States, the Jewish community faces many religious challenges. We face issues of the quality of our Judaism, the decline in some religious observances, of kashrut, of Shabbat, of holidays, of family life, of Jewish identity. The list is very long. You could add to it. Surely we might think that in our context, there must be better texts for us to study. In America, who among the Jews really prays for the return of animal sacrifices in the land of Israel, to the return of temple worship where there are priests who sprinkle animal blood on the altar? In our prayers for redemption, how much can we be expected to link the restoration of Israel to the sacrificial cult of olden days? Well, I suspect that few among us see our ideals of Judaism, our values, connected with the sacrificial system. Indeed, some of the new prayer books that are used edit out prayers for a return to the sacrificial system. We see the issue of sacrifices as history, not as future, as remembering the past, as an heirloom, not as a basis for a living fountain of Judaism. Put Leviticus in the museum. Let's preserve it as a symbol of the primitive practice of our ancestors, but not to be read and studied. I think not. It's interesting, of course, that Judaism takes a very different view. There is a tradition going back to one of our oldest exegesis, our oldest midrashim, that children should begin their education with the study of the book of Leviticus. Rabbi Isi asks, why did they start children's education with the book of Vayikra, of the book of Leviticus? It would make more sense, my kind of rabbi who says, makes more sense for them to start with Breshit, with Genesis, with the stories. But an answer comes not from another rabbi, but from God, as recorded in the Talmud. Said the Holy One, blessed be He, since the sacrifices are pure and the children are pure, let the pure come and engage in the study of the pure. But there's more to the sacrifices than purity, as we shall see, and children are hardly pure, as we all know. I had for many years been puzzled by that midrash, and I know that as a child in a traditional yeshiva, I found the study of Vayikra much less interesting and much less relevant to my Judaism than other sections of the Torah. And I never fully appreciated the profound importance of this book until I read it as a basis for instructing us about today and the future, rather than simply a basis for understanding the past. To make Leviticus relevant is to specify some of the fundamentals of Judaism. So I took it upon myself as a challenge for the next 10 minutes to tell you why I think that that's the case. This was a challenge. If we study the text of Leviticus carefully and thoughtfully, not as a handbook, but as a religious text, we shall see more clearly core elements in Judaism relevant for our age and our time in America and elsewhere. Leviticus is not solely to be read as a rationale for animal sacrifices for another time. Other people brought sacrifices. We did it more humanely. But rather as a basis for rethinking our understanding of the American Jewish community and its future, a living lesson of Judaic values. What are the core messages of Leviticus? There are several that I want to emphasize. Some of the animal sacrifices are all spontaneously motivated sacrifices. They're not those fixed by the calendar on fasts or feasts or Shabbat or holidays. They're not required, but voluntary. The donor of the sacrifice does not give the animal to the priest to prepare, but takes an active role in the ritual. He presents it, lays his hands on the animal, the donor slaughters it, skins it, cuts it. Only in relationship to the altar does the priest get involved. Lesson number 1, the Jewish community welcomes and expects voluntary activity. To be part of the Jewish community means not only the expectations of required ritual, but the welcoming of spontaneous voluntary action. Such action requires activity, not passivity. And your voluntary offering has to be done in a community, within a pattern recognized by the community. Not a private altar, not any ritual you decide. Voluntary, community, public involvement, and the ritual links individual activity to the community. Secondly, one of the voluntary gifts that the Torah teaches about is a korban mincha, a mincha sacrifice, an exclusively cereal offering of grain and flour. The tribute to God should be the fruit of one's labor, but more importantly, this sacrifice is for poor people. It's the poor person's animal sacrifice. No need for expensive gifts, no need for cattle, just flour and grain. That's enough. If you can't afford to participate in some ways, if you want to voluntarily be part of the community, social class cannot be a barrier. Wealth is not the key to community. All can participate, all are involved. There should be no stigma against those who have less resources, who are different. No exclusion based on caste or birth. Everyone can be included, not just the priests, not just the elite of the community. We not only tolerate those who do not have wealth, but need to incorporate in every way within our community all those who want to give of themselves. Everyone can contribute. No one is godlike, just as everyone is holy. That's lesson number 2. Diversity is to be incorporated within the community, not only tolerated. When everyone is included, that makes us a powerful community. The key value of Leviticus is the important role of intent. The ritual of animal sacrifice means absolutely nothing in its pure form, by itself. It has no magic. It has no formal power. Animal sacrifice remains animal sacrifice, pagan, primitive, magical, that is, not Jewish, until there is intent. Intention to convert and transform the ordinary and secular into the holy and the sacred. The process of sanctification, of kedusha, sanctification of the mundane, takes what is prevalent in the culture and incorporates it within the system of Judaism, and that is the core notion of animal sacrifice. The important religious lesson is that Judaism, the values of Judaism, must take from the cultural and real experiences of our lives and change them to make them Jewish, to make them part of our particular culture and values. Sanctifying the mundane requires several steps, so the Torah teaches. We need first to distinguish between the holy and the profane. But separation is not enough. To separate and differentiate requires a new integration. Since you need to move between the profane and the sacred, you can't build walls. We sanctify by the will and intent of individuals, but that too is not enough. For if it was only the will of persons, there would be no ritual, no form, but anarchy, no history, no continuity. You could bring what you want, when you want it, prepare it in your own way. The Torah teaches order and form, structure and specificity. You have to bring some things and not others, prepared in a particular way to a particular place at a certain time. What the ritual adds up to is structure and continuity, and that continuity requires organization and community. Again, spontaneity, but within a community, individual, but within institutions, linked to higher levels of religious expression. So you sanctify by intent of the individual through collective activity and organizational structure. The form in the Torah is through animal sacrifice, but the form itself is not the message. The message, the values that the Torah teaches about the form, is that when so new forms emerge, we know how to sanctify them and incorporate them within our system. When the rabbis decided to replace the animal sacrifice with prayer, they linked the issue of individual intent, community, and ritual. And that's what makes the synagogue a special case of the general process. Note that this message of assimilating from the environment and sanctifying that which you assimilate, that is, making it your own, rejects in the most fundamental sense withdrawal from community, isolation from reality, or performing meaningless rituals that has no human intent. The Torah teaches the incorporation of the mundane, not its rejection, to live in this world, not to withdraw from it, to link the individual not as an isolate, but as part of a community that has links to others and thereby create institutions. Link with a pattern established by tradition and consensus, not for an elite, but for a total community. What wonderful lessons to teach our children and to relearn ourselves. Not only stories about the past, as in Genesis, not only myths and history, as in Exodus, but combining story, myth, history, and institutions, as in Leviticus, that Judaism as a religion provides the opportunity for incorporating change and assimilating from the environment and thereby sanctifying the environment. Judaism involves intent, spontaneity, not just for individuals, but in a structure, in a community. And Judaism is for everyone. Birth, wealth are not the keys, but commitment and involvement are the central values. The three parts to what I tried to present tonight all stress content, community as sources of values. Shmuel Braff teaches us that changes occur in the different context of generational continuity into the future, using culture in new settings for continuity with a difference. The rabbinic conception of the prophet is of teacher, not of futurist, teaching core values to the future generation. Animal sacrifices teach us about the centrality of institutions and communal commitments to integrate new culture Jewishly. Put these three themes together, and you have the basis for the centrality of Jewish values in shaping the Jewish future. Thank you. I said enough to offend a number of people, so you have microphones on either side, and I'm happy to clarify, think about. I wouldn't even mind if you said, that was interesting. That would be okay too, I don't mind. Anybody? I should say something that's really negative then. Now go over there and you have to stand up and so we can hear you. No, I really don't want to comment on Cahill's. Unless you tell me that there's a message there that I should comment on, I don't want to comment on a whole book standing up. It's not fair. The question was, should I comment on a book by Cahill on Gifts of the Jews? If you say, this is his argument, what do you think of the argument? I'm happy to respond to that. The book is a very long book, written with a particular message involved, and I don't want to talk about that right now. Yes?
You've given us a wonderful lesson by drawing metaphorically from Leviticus and centering your metaphor on animal sacrifice along these 4 guidelines. But as a parent, I find it very hard to accept literally the use of Leviticus in instructing children because it runs counter to another value, which is respect for human life. And I can't reconcile this with the blood and the act of sacrifice involving animals, because it does mean the taking of life.
It's a good question. I think if people teach the book of Leviticus in the way I suggest, it may not be so offensive. I find that parts of the book of Genesis isn't very thrilling either. That is, I don't want to teach people that our ancestors were polygamous and had multiple wives. I don't want to teach our children that our prophet Moses, our teacher Moses, married a non-Jew and emphasize that. Or that many other instances in the Bible are things that if I teach them in a silly way, straightforward as literal text, then clearly this is a problem. I understand the sensitivity about issues of killing. I think that one could, and I see no reason why one couldn't, teach the text in a new and creative way and show we're not going to throw this out. This is a book. Why would we have it? We haven't had sacrifices for years. What have we learned from it? And it seems to me that there are ways to treat it. People are sensitive. You can choose between polygamy and animal sacrifice. In all seriousness, the question then is how to teach it, not what the text says. We have a brave someone.
Yeah,
I could ask some questions if you like to me. And
I think I may be thinking too broadly because you gave us such an expansive thing, and so I'm concerned that maybe my question won't be very good. But you can just say
I'll
you don't
rephrase
want
it for
to,
you.
or you can say you just don't want to do it. I guess one of the questions I have is, how is this uniquely Jewish in America? Is this not what other religious traditions are doing in America now? So that how is this really going to define us differently from other religious traditions which, you know, are a part of our culture? How are we going to tell our children that the Christians aren't sanctifying nature and sanctifying community and working mitzvot and so forth? What's the diff?
okay, that's actually a good question. The question, that's a good question and a tough one, and I'm not sure that I'm going to give you a satisfactory answer tonight. The question is essentially what is distinctive. If these are the general principles, what are distinctive about the Jews? I think the first story that I told gives you a feeling for issues of distinctiveness. I think memory is very powerful. I think cultural forms that are handed down, perhaps in new ways, but handed down from parents to children and grandparents to children, have some significance that go beyond the text. I didn't start with the text. I don't think that the issue is the text per se or my interpretation of it or how to use the text to teach about the future and about Jewish values. I think one of the reasons that I would probably use the text, maybe not to start children out, is to say, here is a set of books, a set of texts. There are Bible books and there are Talmud books. There's a whole rich cultural tradition that has survived, and people study. What can we learn from it? I think that makes it specifically unique. It is the case that some Christians use the Hebrew Bible as a basis for some moral lessons. They use, in fact, the prophets and prophecy for that purpose. But their Bible is the New Testament, and therefore they call the Hebrew Bible the Old Testament, and I call it the Hebrew Bible, because it's not old, only if you have something new to replace it. And for me, and I think for Judaism, it is a living text. It is a text that isn't just of the past. It's not just this primitive animal-killing past. I think that we need to say that, and I think we need to say we have a rich cultural history. That cultural history is perhaps specific to Jews. The cultural history is not singular, but diverse. There are many cultural histories of Jews. We need to select from that to teach the next generation of our rich heritage, of our memories, of our history, in ways that have meaning to them. Often what's taught is the history of destruction. This got destroyed. These were the anti-Semites. These were the people who hated us. These were the people who had pogroms against us. These were the people who expelled us, all of which are true. But it is a particular selection from history to emphasize that as a modest balance to the gloom and doom history of the Jews. I would like to say there are very positive things to celebrate in our history as a guide to the future. I fear, if I have one fear, and I have many, but if I have one fear, it is that what we do to teach our children is only that there are enemies out there. If we don't take care of ourselves, and if we don't have our own country, if we don't live in our own communities isolated from others, then we are going to be faced with either killing ourselves off through assimilation or being the product of some kind of anti-Semitic campaign against us. So we'll turn over each stone to see where the next anti-Semitic incident is, because that's what we're teaching often, I exaggerate, but often we teach our children about that. Often we teach our adults about that. We have celebrations of destruction. We need to have the balance. We had a day of memory for the destruction. We need to have more days of celebration of the positive cultural things that Jews do. We have few of those, and we have a lot of the other. I just want to strike a new balance.